Lonely rancher. Found a widow. Freezing in the snow. What she said shattered him. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you listening from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to give it a score from 0 to 10. Now settle in and enjoy the story. The winter wind tore across the prairie of 1879, dragging dry grass in its wake and lashing it against the old wooden fence. Far off in the dark, the lonesome cry of a harmonica drifted like a weary sigh, fading into the pounding rhythm of hooves striking frozen earth. Red dust rose in restless spirals along the trail, whirling toward a solitary ranch, standing small and stubborn against the storm. Inside, Elias Ward sat in silence, the weak flame of a kerosene lamp flickering across a face hardened by loss. Outside, snow fell heavier with each passing moment, the roof groaning against the unrelenting wind. And then a sound split through the storm. 3 knocks, sharp, urgent, desperate. The door shuddered as if it might break apart. Elias rose, his calloused hand trembling as he lifted the lamp. When he pulled the door open, all he saw was a woman collapsing into the snow, her breath shallow, her eyes clouded with frost. That night in the heart of the blizzard, a single knock shattered the silence and stirred back to life a flame thought long extinguished in the soul of a lonely man. The Man and the Silence of the Prairie. On the western plateau of 1879, the wind carried the scent of dry grass and red dust. The mountains in the distance lay blurred beneath drifting snow, while the endless plains stretched out, haunted only by the echo of hooves and the sharp crack of gunfire from lone travelers passing through. Amid that vast emptiness stood a weathered wooden ranch. Its roof was sun-bleached and worn, its fences splintered and broken. And there, moving quietly through each day, was a single man, Elias Ward. Elias was in his 40s now, once a cowboy, once a steady hand with a gun along the trail. But after losing his wife and child to illness, he had turned his back on the town and chosen silence among the barren fields. His only companion was Ash, the old horse who had stood by him through bitter winters, a patient witness to a loneliness no one else could bear. His eyes had grown as hard and dry as weathered wood. His sun-browned hands busied themselves with the same endless chores, splitting firewood, stoking the flames, mending broken fences. To Elias, the world beyond his land had nothing left worth trusting. All that remained was the howl of the wind and the heavy silence of the prairie. Yet sometimes in that silence the past would come rushing back, the laughter of a child, the hurried touch of a wife's hand. Memories that lived only in echoes, while his heart, frozen by years, felt more like stone than flesh. If you were living alone on a ranch like this, what would you do? Would you try to step beyond the grief, or would you choose silence until the very end? Part 1. The Knock in the Storm. Outside, the wind howled long and low like a funeral horn for some nameless traveler. Heavy sheets of snow slammed against the wooden walls, rattling them with a dry, hollow groan. Elias Ward sat motionless in a chair beside the fire, its yellow glow casting a tired light across his weathered face. His eyes, heavy with years of grief, stared through the frost-covered window into the storm. Nights in the Wild West had never been gentle. This land was accustomed to the crack of gunfire across the open plains, to cattle scattering wild before dust storms, and to the wary eyes that hardened whenever a stranger stepped into town. Elias had walked away from all of it. He chose life on the margins because he no longer wished to belong to a world scarred by wounds that never healed. And yet even in silence, memories clung like shadows. Some nights the howl of the storm carried him back to the wails of that day when sickness stole his wife and child. Tonight was no different. He sat with a bottle of cheap whiskey in hand, drinking to dull the ache, hoping time would bury both pain and memory. Outside, his old horse, Ash, pawed at the frozen ground, snorting hard against the cold. The faithful animal had endured storm after storm beside Elias, the last tether keeping him from drifting away entirely. It seemed this night would pass like so many others, cold, endless, forgettable, until a sound broke through. A knock. It struck the door hard, echoing above the wind. Elias jerked the bottle, slipping in his grip. In all the years he had lived in this forsaken place, never had he heard a visitor at night, much less in the teeth of a blizzard. 3 knocks. Urgent. Desperate. The door rattled as though a failing hand beat against it one last time. Elias narrowed his eyes. Rising to his feet, he reached for the revolver hanging on the wall. Instinct. For in the West, kindness could often mean death. His boots struck heavy against the floorboards as he crept toward the door, each step sinking with the tightening beat of his heart. The wind forced a faint cry through the cracks. Elias froze. It could be a fugitive on the run, a con man hunting shelter, or worse, a trap. But it might also be a soul with nothing left but hope. The fire flickered, throwing his shadow across the trembling door. He tightened his grip on the gun, drew in a long breath, and laid his hand on the latch. The moment stretched like a lifetime. Images flashed in his mind, a family once tricked into opening their door only to meet slaughter at the hands of thieves. Out here, suspicion was a lesson learned before trust. Ash screamed from the corral, hooves striking the ground in frantic rhythm. In the wind, Elias could hear it now, the sound of ragged breathing, a body sliding against the wood. A shiver coursed through him. Survival warred against something softer, something buried deep, but not yet gone. The knock carried no malice. It carried the weight of a plea. At last, Elias lowered the gun, but kept it close and pulled the door wide. The storm rushed in, cutting his skin with icy blades. And there, crumpled on the threshold, lay a woman. Her cloak hung in tatters, hair matted with snow lips, blue as death. Her chest rose in shallow gasps, each breath nearly her last. Elias froze. He had never seen anyone so close to the edge. The woman's clouded eyes lifted weakly, and in that fleeting glance he recognized something he had once seen in his own reflection, the look of someone who had lost everything. His heart clenched. Memories he thought buried clawed their way back. His hand shook as she whispered barely more than a sigh, "Help me." And then she collapsed into the snow. In that instant, the gun in his hand felt heavy and useless. Elias dropped to his knees, his calloused hands grasping her frail shoulders. The cold bit through her thin frame as though she were carved from ice. A tide of emotion surged in him, fierce and unexpected. Without another thought, Elias lifted her into his arms and carried her inside, slamming the door against the storm's roar. Firelight flickered over 2 strangers now, one broken by years of solitude, the other fighting for breath. Elias laid her near the hearth, covering her with a thick blanket. His pulse thundered, not with fear, but with the sense that something had just shifted, something he could not name. He glanced at his hands, the same hands that had carried a fragile life from death's edge. Under his breath he muttered, "Why here? And why tonight?" The storm raged on outside. But in the cabin there was only the unsteady rhythm of her breathing. Elias sat across from her, eyes locked on her pale face, feeling deep down that the silence of his life had just been broken forever. And from that moment on, the heart he had thought turned to stone began to stir once more, whispering of a storm, not of snow and wind, but of the soul itself. If you were Elias on a night like this, with a stranger collapsing at your door, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Part 2. The Woman Who Collapsed. The cabin door shut behind him, sealing off the roar of the storm. Elias carried the woman inside and laid her down close to the hearth. The fire crackled and spat, throwing light across her face. Hollow cheeks, pale skin, lips cracked and blue from the cold. Her cloak was thin, torn to shreds, offering no defense against the blizzard that had nearly taken her life. Elias sat back, eyes fixed on the stranger. No one had crossed this threshold since the day he lost his wife and child. This house had been his fortress of solitude, a place to keep the world at bay. And now the presence of this woman unsettled the silence he had guarded for so long. His hand tightened around the revolver at his side. Out here in the Wild West, kindness could be a death sentence. He'd seen drifters feign weakness only to strike the moment they were let inside. But the way her frail shoulders shuddered, the way her fingers curled unconsciously in pain, those were not the movements of deceit. They were the last flickers of a soul on the edge of leaving this world. The storm pounded the roof overhead, But inside the cabin, the only sounds were her ragged breaths and the hiss of the flames. Elias pulled a thick blanket over her, then retreated to a chair across the fire. His gaze was sharp-cutting, as though he could strip away the frost to see what she truly carried within. In the wavering light, the woman's eyes fluttered open. For an instant, Elias caught the pale gray of her gaze, dull with cold, yet carrying a pain without a name. It was not the look of an enemy. It was familiar, for Elias had seen that same emptiness staring back at him from the mirror, the look of someone who had lost everything. A pang struck his chest, though reason fought to hold steady. His voice came rough, brittle, like charred wood breaking. "Who are you? Why come here in the middle of a storm?" Her lips trembled, her words escaping like a faint breath of wind. Clara Hale. I have nowhere else to go." The name hung in the air. Elias narrowed his eyes. Hale. It was a name he knew. From the town across the ridge, there had been whispers once of a widow named Hale, her husband killed in some violent feud. Since then, she had lived under suspicion, shunned by the very community that should have sheltered her. His fingers tightened around the revolver's grip. Memories surfaced, gunfights beneath the wide sky dust storms that swallowed herds whole, the hard stares of men ready to kill over a stranger's shadow. In such a world, a woman wandering into a storm might carry more than sorrow. She might carry danger. He lowered the gun slightly, though kept it within reach. His words cut sharp as steel. "You may be bringing trouble to my door." "I don't need trouble." Clara shivered, clutching the blanket. Between her blue lips, a whisper came out. Part confession, part plea. "I've lost everything. Just like you." The words pierced Elias like an arrow. He froze. Suspicion faltered, melting before the flood of memory. He turned his face toward the fire, its glow dancing against the scarred wooden walls. In the shifting light, he could almost see his family again, his wife's hand brushing his child's laughter at the table. All gone, leaving nothing but silence. Now across from him sat another soul, stripped bare, cast aside, left to weather storms alone. Elias felt an odd pull, a recognition that chilled and comforted all at once, as though fate itself had set the two of them in this place on this night. But a rancher's mercy was something never shown too easily. He shoved the bottle of whiskey aside, voice low and gravelly. "Stay by the fire. You won't die in my house. But don't expect me to trust you yet." Clara nodded weakly. Her eyes, clouded with exhaustion, still managed to shine with something Elias hadn't seen in years, genuine gratitude. Outside, the storm shrieked and tore at the walls, yet inside the flames pushed back the cold. Clara edged closer to the hearth, her trembling hands stretched toward the heat. Slowly, color returned to her skin. Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes half-lidded but never closing. The revolver rested near his hand. He remained guarded, but somewhere deep inside, something had already begun to shift. A seed planted small but stubborn, the faint stirrings of compassion he thought long dead. From the barn, Ash gave a restless whinny, as though sensing the change within these walls. Elias glanced at the window frosted with storm, then back to the woman before the fire. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Tonight was not like other nights. A gust of wind roared past, fanning the flames high. Their light fell across Clara's face, exhausted yet strong, etched with suffering yet unbroken. It reminded Elias of a truth he had buried. Some wounds never heal, but even so, warmth could still be found. "If you were Elias," and a stranger whispered, "I've lost everything. Just like you, what would you do?" Part 3. The Wall of Suspicion. The fire snapped and cracked, its glow painting both faces in shades of red. Clara sat curled beneath a blanket, still trembling, her eyes fixed on the flames. Across from her, Elias leaned forward, his shadow stretched long across the wall, one hand resting on his knee, the other never straying from the revolver at his side. The silence pressed in, thick, broken only by the howl of the storm beyond. Each gust clawed at the cabin like a beast circling its prey. Elias clenched his jaw at every shriek that bled through the cracks. He had never grown used to another soul inside this house, a place that had belonged only to him and the old horse Ash. At last his voice cut through the hush, gravelly and low. "Clara Hale. I've heard that name before. Folks in town say you carry trouble with you. Tell me, what are you running from?" Clara lifted her head. Her face was pale, weary, but her eyes met his directly without flinching. That unshaken look unsettled him more than if she had turned away. Her breath shuddered as she spoke, voice hoarse from cold. "My husband died in a saloon fight. They blamed me. Said it was my fault for holding him back. Called me a curse. Since then, there's been no place for me in that town." Elias narrowed his eyes. He had seen it before, small quarrels spilling into bloodshed and the innocent condemned by gossip. In the West, once a name was stained, no truth could wash it clean. "People will build a lie if it spares them from facing their own guilt," Elias muttered. His tone was flat, unyielding. "But I'm not about to shoulder another person's burden." Clara clutched the edge of the blanket, her thin shoulders trembling. Yet there was no plea in her voice, only a quiet resignation. "Think what you want. I have nothing left to lose." The words cut sharp into the air. Elias felt the weight of their truth. He recognized it. He had spoken it himself, though never aloud. A gust battered the walls, rattling the frail window panes. Elias rose, drew the heavy curtain shut, and stared into the black beyond. And suddenly memories came back, nights under a bleeding sky, the crack of gunfire echoing across the plains, cattle lost to dust storms. The feel of his back turned to the setting sun as he rode on, knowing danger might follow close behind. Suspicion had been his compass. Out here it was the only thing that kept a man breathing. He turned, eyes narrowing on Clara. "Maybe you just need shelter for a night. Maybe you'll bring your troubles crashing down on me tomorrow. I've seen plenty play weak until it was time to drive a knife into a man's back." Clara tilted her head, her gray eyes glinting with both hurt and quiet defiance. "If I'd meant you harm, I wouldn't have knocked. I would have let the storm finish me. But I chose to knock. Because somewhere inside, I still believe there's someone who won't turn away." The words landed heavy. Elias said nothing. He sat again, his gaze locked on her face across the fire. Her features, hollowed by loss, still carried a trace of something he thought gone forever, faith. The silence deepened. Only the pop of burning logs, the wind's cry, and the steady thud of his own heartbeat filled the room. He wanted to doubt her, needed to. But the wall he had built around himself, stone by stone, year after year, now bore its first crack. And that frightened him more than the storm outside. Leaning forward, his voice came low, deliberate. "I can't trust you. Not yet. You'll stay tonight. But come morning, you leave. I won't be tangled up in anyone else's life." Clara's lips curved faintly, a weary smile that carried no bitterness. It was the smile of someone long accustomed to rejection. "If that's what you want, I'll go. But at least tonight I'm alive." Elias turned his eyes away, not wanting her to see the flicker of something breaking through hardness laced with reluctant compassion. The storm hammered on a veil against whatever tomorrow might bring. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. Two strangers sat across from each other, divided by a wall of suspicion neither had the strength to tear down. Not yet. But Elias knew. The first crack was there, and cracks, once made, only grow. If you were Elias, would you keep the wall of doubt standing, or let it fall just once to listen? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes a single choice can change the course of a life. Part 4. The Choking Confession. The fire hissed and popped, scattering sparks like trapped fireflies in winter's cage. Wind pressed hard against the wooden walls, its howl long and hollow, like a lost train whistle drifting across the prairie. Somewhere far in the darkness, a gunshot rang out sharp cold, then vanished into the snow as if swallowed whole by the west itself. Clara held her hands close to the flames, the raw skin of her fingers slowly flushing back to life. Her cloak was threadbare, torn like grass blades ripped by the winter wind. She didn't look at Elias. She looked only at the fire, like a soul trying to measure how much warmth remained in her life to hold on to. Elias sat rigid in his chair, back straight, breath heavy. The revolver rested beside his knee. Snow melted through the cracks, dripping onto the floor, leaving dark stains that spread and froze again. From the barn, Ash snorted the old horse's breath, billowing like fog, an unspoken witness to nights that had no names. Clara swallowed hard, her voice trembling, as though it had to fight its way through the storm to reach him. "I've lost everything, just like you." The wind outside seemed to falter for half a heartbeat. Inside Elias, something cracked, a fine fracture running from his chest to his throat. He didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the fire, watching the colors shift red-gold, then red again. His hand no longer gripped the revolver. Neither of them spoke the words, "I understand." Yet from the silence, from the way they sat facing the fire, it was already spoken. "We share the same wind." Clara tightened the blanket at her neck, her voice breaking again. "At the Flint Bar. You know the place, there were 3 that night. My husband and 2 cowboys just in from the trail, the smell of gunpowder still on their coats. They bragged about driving a lost herd, wanted to trade their stolen profit for whiskey. I pulled my husband's arm, told him to stay out of it. He just laughed, said money was money. A few drinks later, the guns went off." The shot in her memory seemed to pierce the cabin itself. Elias stared at the worn table, the blackened hearthstones, the scarred wood of the floorboards, each mark no different from a bullet scar, silent but permanent. "They said I was cursed," Clara whispered, "that I tugged his arm, made him miss his draw, that every time I set foot in church, the sky turned dark. On the day of his burial, they turned their backs. I tried to give his ring to his mother. She wouldn't take it. I walked that whole hill down alone, empty-handed. From her cloak, she pulled a folded square of cloth. Inside lay a silver band blackened by smoke, split by a thin crack like lightning through stone. She set it gently on the table, yet in the hush it rang like lead striking wood." Elias lifted his eyes. He didn't need to ask why she carried it. He knew. Women of the West always kept some relic of the life they'd lost. A ring, a letter, a button. Something small enough to hold, but heavy enough to lead them home if they ever found the strength to return. When the storm came, Clara murmured, "I stood outside the church. The eyes behind the windows weren't watching to see if I'd survive. They were watching to see when I'd fall. Those eyes." Elias knew them well. He had felt them himself after the fever took his family. They weren't eyes of pity, but of judgment, of relief that tragedy had chosen someone else. Out here, the gun and the wind weren't as cruel as the silence behind a closed door. Snow slapped the walls. Somewhere cattle bawled in panic, their hooves thundering in the frozen dark. Elias closed his eyes, and the sound dragged him back to another night, a dust storm rising red against the horizon, the herd breaking wild calves crushed under hooves as he whipped the reins until his hands bled helpless, deaf, suffocated by chaos. Clara didn't cry. She only touched the ring, nudging it closer to the fire as if trying to thaw a piece of metal that had lain cold too long. "I left because if I stayed, I would learn how to scream, and I don't want to become a scream." Elias looked at the ring. For a moment, its reflection in the fire was not silver at all, but the dark eye of memory staring back at him. He rose without a word, pulled back the curtain, and peered into the white void outside. The air that seeped in smelled of wet leather iron and crushed grass, a storm's old hymn. He remembered the trails he had ridden in darkness, the tavern boards that had echoed his boots, the bed where his wife once lay, coughing her soul away. He remembered digging through frozen ground, the shovel sparking as it struck ice, his forehead pressed against the handle, as if the wood alone could keep him upright. Clara had opened the old door inside him, and behind it, all of it waited. He turned back. "I don't trust you," he said, voice raw, "but I trust the storm." Her eyes lifted, searching his. "The storm doesn't care who we are. It tears down the strong and the weak alike. On nights like this, what we bury inside ourselves, it comes out." Clara nodded as if his words were the answer her confession had been waiting for. From her cloak, she pulled another item, a folded letter, the seal of a cattle contractor. The paper was thin edges, worn, stamped with a debt. "A note of debt," she said. "My husband borrowed to gamble for more." I didn't know. Elias didn't touch it. He only looked, and that was enough. In the West, a family's ruin could fit on a scrap of paper. A promise traded for a death traded for a rumor. The fire sagged low. Elias fed it more wood, the sparks rising against the dark. His hands trembled faintly, not from cold, but from something deeper. If I meant to lie, Clara whispered, I wouldn't hand you these things. She wrapped the ring and letter again in the cloth and pushed it toward him. This is all I have, truth. And if my truth burdens you, throw it into the snow. Elias didn't take it. He nudged the bundle back toward her. Keep it. Those are your way home. Her gaze lingered on him, quiet, steady, lined with exhaustion. A Western woman knows where to hide her tears in her hands as she folds a blanket in her shoulders, as she lifts a beam in her voice when she admits what no one wants to hear. There's a knife, Clara said at last, almost as if she'd forgotten. I carry it for protection. I'll set it here so you don't fear me. She drew a small dagger from her boot, its wooden grip worn smooth by years of sweat. She placed it on the table blade, turned toward herself. The sound of metal on wood was short, dry, and final, like a vow spoken without words. Elias studied it. His reflection wavered on its edge. He remembered the story of a traveler who had collapsed at a stranger's door, only to rise at midnight with a knife in hand. In the West, a wrong trust killed faster than a right suspicion. But tonight, the knife lay still, turned inward. The wind shifted, tugging the curtain like the house itself had taken a breath. From the barn, Ash neighed softly, no longer frantic, but calm, as if he too had decided. Horses knew the smell of malice, and this woman carried none. Elias reached not for the knife, but for the kettle on the shelf. He poured a cup, the steam rising, and set it gently before her. Drink, then sleep. Clara's hands brushed his, as she took it just for a heartbeat, like a bird skimming the surface of water. But it was enough. Elias felt the warmth in his own palm and knew it was not from the fire. The night drifted on like a river breaking through ice. Clara's eyes closed at last, the empty cup slipping to the floor beside her. Before sleep claimed her, she murmured not as a question, but as a truth already carved into the air. I've lost everything, just like you. Elias watched her as she slept, her hair scattered across her brow, the silver ring peeking from its cloth like a lone star against the storm. The knife lay untouched. The folded letter curled at the edges like a door waiting to open. And Elias's heart, silent for years, deaf even to the sound of his own harmonica, heard again. Heard the wind, but no longer as a predator's cry. Heard the wood groan, but no longer as a stranger's step. Heard the fragile pause between a woman's breaths, pauses that could kill if left alone, but save if someone stayed near enough to count them. He stood, took down a gray wool scarf from the peg, the last thing he had kept of his wife, still faint with the scent of smoke from a long-gone hearth. After a long hesitation, he draped it gently across Clara's shoulders. It hurt like snapping a piece of his own bone to brace another. Yet with that hurt came the fall of ice in his chest, cracking, melting, hissing into the fire like thunder in miniature. Ash pawed the ground outside. The herd had quieted. The storm itself seemed to soften its voice, less a howl, more a lullaby. At the edge of night dawn, waited pale and thin, not yet brave enough to rise. Elias sat again, turning his face away so as not to meet her features in sleep. He whispered, not for her, not for anyone, only for the fire and the wind. No one should die on my doorstep. The silence answered with warmth, and then, as if sealing his own words against the gale, Elias pushed the dagger farther across the table, its blade now angled toward himself, a gesture small but final, like wiping away a sentence already written. The house exhaled. Outside, the west gathered its storms, tucked away. The gunshot in the roots of the grass erased hoofprints from the trail and closed every prying eye behind shuttered doors. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered over two lives bound by nothing. Promised. Nothing sworn, only a single truth enough to fill the night. I see you. And I am here. If you were Elias caught between suspicion and mercy, would you keep the gun closer? Or pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders? Leave a comment below. Sometimes, a single choice, small as it seems, can change the course of a life. Part Fee, Ash, Bose. His head, outside the storm, had softened. The wind no longer screamed like a predator on the hunt. Snow fell slower now, spinning gently to the ground like silver feathers across the prairie. From far off, a single gunshot cracked the silence, maybe a drunk cowboy testing his aim, maybe a herdsman driving off wolves. Either way, the sound was a reminder the West never let a man sleep in peace. In the barn, Ash pawed at the floor, hooves drumming against the wood. The old horse had been with Elias for near 20 years, through summers that scorched the grass to ash, through dust storms that painted the sky blood red through the bitter day. Elias buried his wife and child beneath the hill. Ash had never let strangers near. Once he'd even thrown a neighbor to the dirt for laying a hand on his mane. For Elias, Ash was the last half of his soul, the final gate between him and the rest of the world. And yet tonight, with Clara sitting by the fire, Ash no longer raged. He only sighed long, heavy, and grew still. Elias noticed an unease stirred in him. Dawn had not yet broken, but the storm was spent. Elias stepped outside the door, creaking behind him. The cold bit his skin, but the wind was gentler than the night before. The sky had turned a pale gray. The prairie stretched out in a white shroud, silent as mourning cloth. Ash shook his head, mane heavy with frost. Elias laid a hand on the horse's neck, whispering, "My old friend. We're not used to strangers under this roof, are we?" Ash blew steam through his nostrils, clouds rising like thought itself. For a moment, Elias could almost believe the animal was pondering like a creature that had seen more of life than its own master. Behind him, a sound, the soft tread of hesitant steps. Clara stood at the door, the blanket drawn tight around her narrow shoulders. She trembled not only from the cold, but from caution. Elias turned, ready to tell her to go back inside when something happened he did not expect. Ash moved. The horse stepped forward, slow and deliberate hooves striking the boards with a rhythm that echoed Elias's own heartbeat. Elias held his breath. In all his years, Ash had never allowed another to come so close. Clara stood frozen, clutching the blanket. Ash stopped before her, lowered his head, and met her gaze with eyes deep and dark as canyon shadows. Then, gently, so gently Elias could hardly believe, Ash pressed his muzzle against her hand. Clara startled, but did not pull away. Her trembling fingers reached out, brushing the horse's mane. In her eyes shimmered something fragile, not quite tears, but wonder mixed with gratitude. Elias felt his chest tighten. He had seen Ash strike at intruders, had heard him snarl like thunder when strangers dared approach. But this Ash bowing to a woman he'd never known, this was something Elias had never witnessed. Something inside him broke. Like the stone walls he'd built for years were shattered in a single motion, not by words, not by time, but by his own horse bowing its head. Clara stroked Ash's mane, her voice trembling. "I once had a horse, but he died last winter. Since then, I couldn't bring myself to touch another." Ash exhaled long and deep, pressing closer, as if to say, "I hear you." Elias stepped near, heart heavy. Watching Clara's hand upon Ash's neck felt like watching some quiet ceremony, a communion beyond reason. His horse had refused the finest feed from strangers' hands, yet here he stood yielding to her. "This horse," Elias rasped, "has never done that for anyone but me." Clara turned, her eyes rimmed red. "Maybe he knows my loss, the way you do." Elias swallowed hard. Her words hit him like rocks rolling down a cliff. He wanted to turn away to rebuild the wall of doubt, but Ash had already torn it down. And through the rubble, a faint light flickered. Together they led Ash out into the yard. The horizon was still gray, but at its edge a weak line of dawn stretched thin across the sky. The wind eased, leaving behind a rare holy silence of the west after storm. Ash stood calm, his head resting against Clara's hand. Elias watched, torn between disbelief and a stirring warmth he couldn't name. For the first time in years, he did not feel like the last man left in the world. A black crow cut across the sky, cawing harshly, a reminder that danger always lingered. Yet even so, Elias felt something stronger than the threat of misfortune, the fragile truth that trust could be born in the unlikeliest of places. Clara lifted her eyes to his lips, parted though no words came. That look alone, soft, unguarded, was enough to make Elias feel less alone. Ash shook his mane, pawed the ground, then sighed as if giving witness. Elias understood. The horse had spoken in the only way he could, offering a sign Elias could not deny. If it were you, when the most loyal creature of your life bows its head to a stranger, would you trust its judgment or keep your heart locked tight? Leave your thoughts below. Sometimes it takes the instinct of an animal to see what a man cannot. Part 6. The flame. Rekindled night had deepened. Outside, the wind had ebbed, leaving only the faint, mournful cry of a lone wolf somewhere across the snowbound prairie. Silence lay heavy like a curse stretched over the land. But inside the cabin, the fire still burned alive and restless. Elias leaned forward, adding a few more dry logs to the hearth. The flames leapt higher, casting light across his face and Clara's two weary faces, now sitting closer than before. Clara drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, though not only against the cold. In the glow of firelight, she lifted her gaze and caught a fleeting softness in Elias's eyes. Like the fire itself, they had once been ash, but now a thin spark flickered there. He said nothing, only dragged his chair nearer, close enough that he wouldn't have to raise his voice against the storm. For a man of the West, that was the only confession he knew how to give. "I'll let you sit closer." Clara stretched her trembling hands toward the warmth. "There were nights," she whispered, "when I thought I'd freeze to death out by the graveyard beside my husband's marker. No one would know. No one would care. But when the fire flares like this, I remember I'm still alive." Her words fell like stones into Elias's chest. Memory rose unbidden. Another night, years passed, a dust storm roaring across the plains, ash straining beneath him as he fought to turn a panicked herd. Calves' bald hooves thundered, red grit swallowed the sun. Somewhere in the chaos, a young one went down, trampled into silence. Elias came home that night to the glow of fire, his wife waiting with their child in her arms. The warmth of that hearth had since turned to ashes inside him. His voice broke out low and rough, as if to smother the memory. A fire only burns as long as it's fed. No wood, it dies. Clara turned her eyes steady in the flickering light. Then, "You just added more wood, which means you don't want it to die." Elias froze. He couldn't decide if her words angered him for touching the wound or relieved him for naming what he hadn't dared admit. But the fire roared, undeniable, illuminating the truth. His hands had trembled as he laid the logs in place. From beyond the cabin walls came the faint echo of hooves, maybe a caravan racing to beat the tail of the storm. The sound made Elias tense. The West never ceased reminding him of its dangers. His eyes hardened for a moment, then shifted back to Clara. Questions rose in his throat, sharp, defensive, but the fire carved out a space where no questions were needed. Instead, he simply watched Clara as her eyelids drooped, her lashes damp, though no tears fell. Hers was not the weeping of the weak, but of one who had borne too much for too long. Something inside him gave way. With a weary sigh, Elias set his revolver on the shelf instead of keeping it in his hand. A small gesture, but for him, it was as if he had spoken aloud. "I don't see you as danger anymore." Rising, he pulled an old blanket from the wooden chest and held it out. Clara hesitated, then took it, her hand brushing his. The touch was fleeting, but enough to send a jolt through the silence between them. Only the pop of burning wood filled the gap. "I never thought I'd sit in a warm cabin again," Clara murmured. "With a fire. With someone willing to look me in the eye." Elias didn't answer. He only sat down again, but closer now. The firelight shifted across his features, turning years of hard lines into something gentler, truer. From the barn came Ash's hoofbeat, steady, almost like a nod of approval. The old horse who had witnessed all Elias's years of silence seemed to recognize what had entered the house tonight, a second breath not unwelcome. The flames brightened, licking higher, tracing cracks in the wooden walls, scars in the old floorboards, and cracks too in the frozen walls around two battered hearts. Elias leaned back, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, felt the edge of solitude lift away. Clara's voice drifted through the quiet, soft as wind. "Don't you see? This fire isn't only warming me, it's warming you too." Elias opened his eyes. For a heartbeat, he wanted to deny it, to pull his armor back around him. But the fire glowed, and Clara's face was touched with a color he hadn't seen before, living warmth. He knew then that she was right. His heart, long thought dead ash, was burning again, fragile, slow, but real. Outside, the storm unraveled. On the horizon, a blade of pale light pierced the night, sharp as a knife against the dark. The hearth fire blazed, but now another flame stirred as well, one rekindled inside Elias Ward. If it were you on a winter's night when someone else tended a fire that warmed not just themselves, but you admit that you needed that warmth. Part 7. Memories Awakened. Beyond the wooden door, the wind roared low like some restless demon running the length of the prairie. The blizzard had passed, but the western wind never truly slept. It slipped through cracks in the boards, rattled the walls, and carried a mournful song across the night. Elias leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. Clara, wrapped in her blanket near the fire, watched him quietly. In the flickering glow, his face was carved deep, high cheekbones, sun-darkened skin, the faint scar tracing his jaw. Yet she saw at once that he was not looking at the flames. His gaze went through them, far past them, into a place darker than the night outside. A heavy breath escaped his chest, followed by a slight shake of his head, as if trying to banish the images rising inside him. But the wind still howled, and memories once woken do not retreat so easily. "This house," Elias said at last, voice rough, slow, once had light every evening. My wife cooking stew, my little girl running across these boards, her footsteps loud as a drum. I'd ride home from the range bone-tired, but the moment I heard her laugh, it was all worth it." He stopped, staring into the fire as though it might bring their shadows back from the ash. "One time a dust storm rolled in. The herd stampeded, I nearly lost it all. But when I came home, my girl was at the window, holding the harmonica I'd given her. She played it clumsy, halting. And to me, it sounded like the whole prairie had stilled to listen. The wind struck harder outside, rattling snow and sand against the walls." Elias gave a faint laugh, but it cracked in his throat. "That world, it lives only in my head now." Clara lowered her gaze, clutching the blanket tighter. She could feel the weight in each word he spoke, words dragged up like stones from the bottom of a well. Elias's eyes darkened. His voice thinned, trembling like a dull blade scraping stone. "That winter fever swept through town. I thought the ranch set apart would be safe. But then, my wife began to cough. My little girl burned with fever. I rode Ash through a storm to fetch the doctor. By the time I came back, it was too late." His hand shook faintly where it rested on his knee. Clara looked up, and what she saw in his eyes hollowed her chest. Not tears, but a pain long dried into salt, into cracks etched for life. "I dug their graves under the hill," Elias whispered. "The ground was frozen. The shovel struck sparks from the earth. I buried them both. On their mound I planted a dead cactus branch. The wind bent it, but it never broke. I thought maybe that was how they still watched over me." Outside, the herd bellowed in panic, their hooves pounding as the wind drove them past the cliffs. The thunder of it made Clara shiver. It was as if nature itself was echoing the chaos of the night Elias had carried inside him all these years. He covered his face with a weathered hand. "Since then, I never set foot in church again. Folks looked at me like I was cursed, whispered that I should have saved them. I once thought to end it with a gun." Clara drew a sharp breath. The confession struck like a knife, bare and brutal, showing the deepest wound in the man across from her. "But Ash," Elias said softly that night he collapsed on the threshold. "Wouldn't leave me. He looked at me like he knew, and I couldn't pull the trigger." Clara pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. By the firelight, she no longer saw a hardened cowboy. She saw a man locked in this wooden house wrestling each night with ghosts. Elias drew in a long breath and dropped his hand, meeting her eyes. You ask why I don't trust because anyone can leave or be taken, and all that's left is silence. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then slowly she unfolded her blanket, reached out, and laid her frail hand over his. Her touch was cold, but it made him still, struck him silent. You're not the only one who's lost everything, Clara whispered. I was left behind too, but I'm still here, sitting at your fire. Maybe neither of us has to be alone anymore. Elias looked at her hand, his heart pounding with something raw, unguarded. Outside, the wind seemed to retreat the prairie, bowing to this fragile moment between two broken souls. He didn't answer. He only tightened his grip over hers. The fire leapt high, flooding the cabin with light spilling into the deepest cracks of his spirit. The night was long yet, but in that moment Elias knew his memories were no longer a burden he carried alone. They had been shared, and in that sharing they felt lighter, truer, maybe even healing. If you were Elias, after years of burying your grief in silence, would you dare speak it to a stranger just so you wouldn't have to carry it alone? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes one broken confession is the first step toward healing. Part the 8. The silence they shared. The fire still burned its light, climbing the wooden walls in shifting patterns like fragments of half-remembered dreams. Clara sat turned toward the hearth, her eyes following the rise and fall of the embers. Elias leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on his knee. He didn't close the distance between them, but he didn't rebuild the wall that once stood there either. Outside, the wind had changed its voice. No longer the long, hungry howl of a beast, but a softer whistle like a flute played in the dark. Neither spoke, yet the silence itself weighed more than words. Elias had known silence all his life, silence of empty rooms, of meals taken alone, of nights when footsteps echoed only his own. But this silence was different. It was not hollow. It carried two heartbeats, keeping time with a single flame. Clara tucked her hands beneath the blanket, hiding the redness brought by the fire. Her eyes drifted toward Elias, not the man of cold timber she had first met, but someone learning slowly how to sit beside another soul. From far across the prairie, a gunshot cracked the air, short, sharp, then gone. Elias's eyes opened at once. He didn't startle, but his gaze sank low, heavy. He knew the sound well, a drunk cowboy testing his pistol, or a herdsman driving off wolves. In this land, the difference hardly mattered. Death was always close. In his mind, the gunfire stirred old storms, a night of red dust cattle bawling in chaos, hooves splitting the earth as ash carried him through. He remembered the taste of grit in his teeth, the thrum of panic in his veins. The West had always been this way. Life could shatter at any moment. Clara didn't ask. She didn't flinch. She closed her eyes, let her head rest back against the wall. She knew too well that in this country, a lone shot in the night might mean nothing or everything. And for the first time, Elias realized he was not the only one who understood the cruel rhythm of this land. The firelight danced across her face, and for an instant, Elias remembered the town, the eyes that had followed him when he walked into the saloon, curious, pitying, then turning away. Those stares had driven him back to this ranch, to silence. Now looking at Clara, he knew she had carried those same stares, the suspicion after her husband's death. Two souls marked and cast aside, sitting together without needing to explain. And in that silence was a strange comfort. At least one other heart carried the same wound. Clara's breath slipped into the sound of the fire. Elias turned his head, catching her gaze. They didn't speak, but the look they shared said more than words ever could. Outside, the wind beat against the roof like a slow drum. In the barn, ash whinnied once, then fell quiet. The world drew itself small down to two people and the fire between them. Elias didn't know why he didn't rise, didn't turn away. He only knew his chest ached, not with the sharpness of grief, but with something else, something that reminded him he still lived. Clara dropped her eyes, her lips trembling faintly. Not a smile, but a loosening, the fragile sign of a woman finally allowing herself to trust, if only a little. The fire burned low, but its warmth lingered in the room. Neither of them slept. They simply sat listening to the wind, to the crackle of ash, to the silence that needed no filling. In that silence, their hearts touched not with promises, not with embraces, but with presence. Elias leaned forward, pushed another log onto the fire. The flames leapt, painting both faces bright. A man scarred by wounds that never healed. A woman bent beneath loss she could not shed. And in that instant it became clear pain, when shared, can soften into something else, into the steady breath of peace. If you have ever known such a silence where no words are needed, only the presence of another, do you believe that is how the heart finds its way home? Leave your thoughts below. Sometimes silence itself is the last flame we carry. Part 9. Words that melt the ice. The fire had burned all through the night, its glow casting two wavering silhouettes against the wooden walls, two figures held in silence. Elias sat heavy in his chair, calloused hand resting on his knee, his eyes wandering somewhere beyond the storm's howl. Across from him, Clara sat with her shoulders trembling, not from cold but from something harder to name. Outside, the prairie raged. In the distance, a gunshot cracked the night dry and sharp, then fell silent. Almost at once, the cattle answered their frightened cries, rising hooves pounding the frozen earth in chaos. Elias closed his eyes. That sound, it was his soul made flesh, forever stampeding, forever trying to outrun its own pain. Through the clamor, he heard Clara draw a deep breath, then let it out slow, as if bracing herself. Elias opened his eyes. She was looking at him now, her gaze steady, though rimmed with unshed tears. Her hand moved thin and frail, but certain, resting lightly on his. He started the instinct of a cowboy ready to recoil, but the touch did not demand. It did not bind. It simply rested there, warm against the hardened skin of his palm. A woman's hand, but warm in a way he had almost forgotten. Warm like fire, not flickering but enduring. And in that instant a memory struck him, his wife long ago laying her hand the same way on his after long days in the saddle when he came home broken from the trail. That simple touch had once kept him standing against the guns, the storms, the endless dust. And now, years later, another hand had brought that feeling back to life. Elias swallowed hard, his breath ragged. Part of him wanted to push it away, but his body remained still, as though it had waited for this moment all along. Clara's fingers tightened gently, and she whispered, "You are not alone." 4 words, yet they pierced through the ice that had encased his heart for years. The laughter of his child, the breath of his wife against his ear, the scornful eyes of the town, all of it broke loose in a single rush. Outside, the wind swept the plain, lifting snow like 1,000 restless ghosts. But within the cabin, the fire leapt higher, as if awakened by her words. Elias did not understand why. Perhaps sometimes a single truth spoken aloud could change the very air itself. He turned to her, his eyes unsteady. For the first time in years, he felt seen not as a shadow haunting the prairie, but as a man of flesh and bone, still alive, still capable of being held. He lifted a hand to cover his eyes. A rancher's tears were rare out here. The wind dried them before they could fall. But now his vision burned, his throat ached. Clara said no more. Her hand stayed firm as a cactus holding its place in the desert. Elias lowered his hand at last, meeting her gaze. His voice came rough, as though dragged from deep within all these years. "I thought silence was all I had left, but tonight you broke it." Clara's weary smile shone faintly in the glow. No one should live in silence forever. Even here in a land of wind guns and storms, we still need one voice to remind us we're not alone. Her words shook him. For a lifetime he had believed survival came from suspicion. But here now he realized there was something stronger than the gun. It was the touch of a hand that refused to let go. The fire blazed bright, spilling light across their faces. One man thought long turned to stone. One woman thought long reduced to ash. Between them, a narrow crack opened enough for warmth to slip through, enough to thaw the ice. This time, Elias squeezed her hand back. Firm, not the grip of a cowboy holding reins, but of a heart admitting it still lived. Outside, the wind gentled. The cattle quieted. The prairie seemed for once to lay down its arms. And in that small cabin, a widowed rancher heard words he thought he'd never hear again. "You are not alone." And Elias believed. If you were Elias after years of locking your heart away when a hand found yours and a voice whispered that you were not alone, would you have the courage to believe it? Leave a comment below. Sometimes a single gentle word is enough to shatter the walls a lifetime has built. Part X. Light within the storm. Outside, the storm still howled. The wind lashed the prairie like 1,000 knives, driving snow into towering white columns. But inside the small wooden cabin, the fire burned bright, casting its glow against frosted windows like a beacon against the dark. Elias and Clara sat close. They did not speak and did not need to. The light upon their faces told the difference. Elias was no longer the silent statue he had become, and Clara no longer the weary shadow she had been. They sat quietly, letting warmth flow between them, covering the distance that once seemed impossible. From the stall outside, Ash exhaled, lowering his head. The old horse's breath mingled with the crackle of wood, forming a rough, simple music yet alive. Elias looked around the cabin, the scratches on the table, the splintered planks across the floor. Once these had been marks of loneliness. Tonight, beneath the fire's glow, they seemed to breathe again, like his own heart returning to life. Another gunshot cracked in the distance, dry hollow, swallowed by winter. Once it would have tensed every muscle in his body, recalling the chaos of stampeding cattle dust storms and suspicious eyes in saloons. But not tonight. Tonight it was only another sound in the wilderness. His stillness was stronger than gunfire. Clara's hand rested lightly over his, steady and warm. That silence held more power than any weapon. Clara smiled faintly, her voice soft, spent, but calm. The wind still rages, but in here, it can't touch us. Elias dipped his head in a quiet nod. For the first time in years, a thought simple and whole settled in him. The storm is not so frightening when one no longer faces it alone. He fed more wood to the flames. The fire leapt high, its light catching his eyes that shone now after years dulled to ash. Clara saw it and understood. She had not only been saved from the storm, Elias himself had been saved from his own night. Her whisper drifted like breath. Maybe tonight didn't just save me. Maybe it saved you, too. A rough, broken laugh left him hoarse but real. He did not deny it. He turned to her, his eyes unsteady yet certain. The fire in the hearth was the fire in his chest, bright, warm, alive. Ash shook his mane, stamping once as though in answer. The sound stirred a memory, his daughter's laugh at the sound of hooves, her small hands waving from the window. That memory no longer tore at him. It touched him gently, like a reminder that love does not die, it only waits to be awakened. The storm raged on, but the cabin blazed like a lighthouse in a sea of snow. From miles away, any wanderer lost upon the plain would see it and know there is life here. There is warmth. Elias realized it too. For years he had kept this house as a tomb, barring all from its doors. Tonight it lived again, no longer a place of mourning, but a shelter. Not only for himself, but perhaps for others who had lost their way. Clara leaned closer, no longer hiding her weariness. A faint smile lingered on her lips, small, ordinary, yet brighter than the fire itself. Elias looked upon that smile, and for the first time he did not regret opening his door the night before. The prairie outside lay white, the blizzard unbroken. But in the cabin, two souls sat together, bound by the same fire. And that made the storm no longer an end, but the beginning of something new. Elias tilted his head, his voice low like a vow. The storm out there may be long, but in here, we'll keep the fire. Clara nodded, her hand tightening softly on his. In the glow, their eyes shone not with the light of wood or flame, but with hearts learning to believe again. That night, a widowed rancher and a forsaken widow found each other. And in the heart of a western blizzard, a cabin burned bright, not with fire alone, but with the truth that it is never too late to begin again. If you were a wanderer, lost in the storm, and saw a cabin burning bright against the snow, would you have the courage to knock, or would you pass the light by? Leave a comment below. Sometimes the light in the storm is the only thing strong enough to save an entire life. Dawn after the storm. The snow had begun to melt, revealing damp brown earth and the deep wheel ruts left from the night before. Across the wide plateau, the morning sun poured golden light like honey, spreading warmth over the frozen west. Elias led his old horse Ash out of the stable, his steps steady, while Clara followed quietly at his side. They didn't need words. A single glance between them was enough. In Elias's eyes, the frost of many years had melted away. In Clara's, the fear had vanished. What remained was trust, a fragile, flickering flame rising from ashes. But then from the trail that led toward town came the pounding of hooves. Red dust rose in the cold morning air. Elias halted, his hand tightening on the reins. Clara froze as well, her face draining of color, as though an old nightmare had suddenly caught up to her. Through the haze of dust, a lone rider emerged, cloaked in black, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. When he finally lifted his head, his piercing eyes cut like steel. Clara gasped, unable to breathe. Elias saw it at once, the terror rooted deep within her, the fear she had carried all along her flight. The world seemed to stop, and Elias knew he had to choose. Push Clara away to keep himself clear of a danger that was never his, or step in front of her, accepting that from this moment on, his solitude was over. He turned, catching Clara's gaze. She trembled, but gave the faintest nod as if whispering, "Please, don't leave me." Elias took one step forward, placing himself between her and the rider. His hand slid down to the revolver at his side. In the roaring wind and the glow of the morning sun across his weathered face, Elias Ward was no longer a broken man of silence. He was a rancher again, and this time he would not turn his back on another soul. Ash let out a fierce neigh, and Clara clutched the back of Elias's coat. In that instant, a new beginning carved itself deep into their hearts. No one is ever too late to be loved. In the storm, the presence of just one soul can save an entire life. Do you believe that even in the coldest night, a flame still waits for you? And if you were Elias, would you have stayed or ridden away into the wild? Let me know in the comments. Sometimes one small choice can change a life forever.